audience. And I really do want to sincerely thank every one of you for coming and for giving such support to all we're trying to do in SPERI. As I think you know, the annual lecture is our big public event of the year, and we try to select a really interesting speaker who's likely to have something challenging and original to say about the political economy of this very uncertain era that we're all living through. Our first annual lecturer was the Right Honourable Ed Miliband, and his lecture took place in this hall in February 2012. Last year, the 2013 lecture was given by Robert Peston, then the BBC, then the business editor of the BBC, now the economics editor. And tonight, the 2014 SPERI annual lecture will be given by George Monbiot, the writer and environmental and political activist, although I'm not sure that's a very succinct description of all that, the different things that George is. I don't know what you think, George, about being grouped in this threesome with Ed Miliband and Robert Peston, but then again, perhaps I should ask them what they think about being grouped with George. Although my colleagues will know how of my natural affinity with the world of Twitter, and I can reveal that Robert Peston today tweeted just after lunchtime his admiration for George's latest column in today's Guardian, so they are at least reading each other. Let me say a little bit more about George by way of introduction. As implied then, you'll all know him from his regular column in The Guardian, which he's been writing since 1996. I read it myself because unlike most or many newspaper columnists, I don't ever quite know what George will be writing about and what he'll be saying, but I know it'll be seriously done and well researched, and it'll make me think whether or not I agree with it. And I think that's really George's purpose. He notes somewhere himself, I think on his website, that he doesn't any longer even agree with all of his columns himself. They're written to challenge us, and all of them are available actually on the marvellous website that George has created, and it is a place well worth spending a little bit of reading time. Even by his own account, George happened upon his current role as a commentator and activist in an unplanned way. He's written that he sees life, and I'm quoting here, as a slightly unhinged adventure whose perpetuation is something of a mystery. He read zoology at Oxford and loved his course, but not the Oxford culture. He started making wildlife programs for the BBC, but was then drawn into a series of adventures to Indonesia, to the Amazon, to northern Kenya, during which time he began to engage with really difficult environmental issues. He discovered social movements, and he nearly died of malaria. On coming back to Britain, he got involved in protests against road building and the politics of land use. He talked his way into writing some op-ed pieces for The Guardian and gradually found his current niche as a distinctive radical voice, exploring all manner of environmental, political and economic issues, and usually asking the toughest of questions about our inadequate collective response to them. And books have also poured from George's computer. In addition to early books reporting on his travels and associated political activities, he's also written Captive State, the Corporate Takeover of Britain, The Age of Consent, Heat, How to Stop the Planet Burning, Bring On the Apocalypse, and most recently published just last year a really striking book called Feral, Searching for Enchantment on the Frontiers of Rewilding. This was a book about large-scale restoration of ecosystems, setting out something, as George himself has put it, that environmentalists could be for, not just against. We're only a few weeks away from the paperback edition, but George has earlier tonight signed some hardback copies of Feral, and these are available at what Blackwell's asked me to describe as a heavily discounted price at the stall outside after the lecture. In short, George is someone who unquestionably we listen to in contemporary political economy, especially if the field is defined as we define it in SPERI, as embracing the impact of severe environmental threat on the whole modernist growth project. He was quoted very supportively in a book that I've been reading over Easter, the best book, incidentally, on the crisis, by the way, that I've yet read. It's written by an American academic called Philip Mirofsky, and it's called Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste, How Neoliberalism Survived the Financial Meltdown. And George is quoted on page 30 of that book for having written in The Guardian as early as August 2007, and remember that things began to kick off in a big way only really in 2008. George wrote, "We are all neoliberals now," and Mirofsky notes that in saying this, Monbiot was eerily prescient. So we're delighted to have you here, George, tonight to deliver the SPERI lecture, and I now welcome you to come up on the stage and speak to your chosen topic.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Tony, and for those extremely kind words, and thank you, everyone, for coming along. I wouldn't mind a little bit more light on the audience, if that's all right. It's quite nice to see who I'm talking to, if you don't mind, in the box up there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing at the moment the death of that phenomenon with which Tony ended his very kind introduction, both the theory and the practice of neoliberal capitalism. And this is the doctrine which holds that the market can resolve almost all social and economic and political problems. It holds that the people are best served and their prosperity is best advanced by the minimum of intervention and spending by the state, and that through people pursuing their own self-interest through the invisible hand of that market, we can maximize the general social interest. And to illustrate the spectacular crashing and burning of that doctrine, which unfortunately sort of survives in terms of its doctrinal impacts, even if it's in no way resembles its formative principles. Let me tell you the sad tale of a man called Matt Ridley, who was formerly a columnist on the Daily Telegraph. And then he became, and I think this tells us something about the meritocratic claims of neoliberalism, he became the hereditary chair of Northern Rock. His father had been chair of Northern Rock before him, and as a result of that, that was his sole qualification. He became the chair of Northern Rock, the formerly Building Society and then Bank. And while he was a columnist on the Telegraph, he wrote the following. Let me just dig out this quote here. "The government is a self-seeking flea on the backs of the more productive people of this world. Governments do not run countries, they parasitize them." And he argued that taxes, bailouts, regulations, subsidies, intervention of any kind are an unwarranted restraint on market freedom. So Mr. Ridley, as he was then, was able to put some of that into practice when he became chairman of Northern Rock, and boy, did he do it. And he pursued the market freedom of the kind that he'd been advocating for so long in his columns. And you can see the results today, ladies and gentlemen, on your bank statements. In 2007, Matt Ridley had to go cap in hand to the self-seeking flea and beg it for what became £27 billion. This was rapidly followed by the first run on a British bank since 1878. The government had to guarantee all the deposits of the investors in the bank, and eventually it had to nationalise the bank, being the kind of parasitic self-seeking flea that it is, in order to prevent more or less a complete collapse of the banking system. By comparison to Mr. Ridley, the likes of Paul Flowers, our poor old Crystal Methodist, were pretty half-hearted. And in fact, about the only things which distinguish Mr. Flowers from the rest of the banking fraternity was that A, he allegedly bought his own cocaine, and B, he singularly failed to bring the entire banking system to its knees. Where's Mr. Ridley now? Oh, we don't call him Mr. Ridley anymore. He sits in the House of Lords as a Conservative peer. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how our system works. And it's not just that neoliberalism has failed spectacularly in that this system, which was supposed to prevent state spending and persuade us that we didn't need state spending, has required the greatest and most wasteful state spending in history to bail out the deregulated banks, which were deregulated according to neoliberal doctrine, and trash the entire economy as a result. But also because it has singularly failed to create this great society of innovators and entrepreneurs that we were promised by the masters of this doctrine, by people like von Hayek and Milton Friedman and the rest of it, who said this is going to create a society of entrepreneurs. As Thomas Piketty, the name which is on everybody's lips at the moment, so adeptly demonstrates in his new book, Capital in the 21st Century. What has happened during this era, over the past 30 years or so, has been a great resurgence of patrimonial capitalism, of a rentier economy, where you make far, far more money, either by owning capital or by positioning yourself as a true self-serving flea up on the backs of productive people, a member of an executive class whose rewards are out of all kilter with its performance or the value delivered. You make far more money in either of those positions than you possibly can through entrepreneurial activity. If wealth under this system were the inevitable result of hard work and enterprise, every woman in Africa would be a millionaire. And so just at this moment, this perfect moment of total moral and ideological collapse of the neoliberal capitalist system, a large number of environmentalists stumble across it and say, this is the answer to saving the natural world. And they devise a series of ideas and theories and mechanisms which are supposed to do what we've been unable to do by other means, which is to protect the world which we depend on and everything around us depends on, the living planet, from the despoilation and degradation which have done it so much harm over the past few decades. And this is the pursuit of what could be called the natural capital agenda. The pricing, the valuation, the monetization, the financialization of nature in the name of saving it. Oh, sorry, did I say nature? We don't call it that anymore. It's now called natural capital. And ecological processes are called ecosystem services because, of course, they exist only to serve us. And hills, forests, rivers, I hope you don't call them that anymore. That's terribly outdated terms. They are now called green infrastructure. While biodiversity and habitats, also not at all a la mode, my dear, we now call them asset classes in an ecosystems market. I'm not making any of this up. This is what these things are now being called. And people argue, they say, look, and you know, these are perfectly respectable and plausible arguments, and I don't want to diss them in their entirety, just diss them 99% of the way. They say, look, we're failing magnificently, we're totally, monumentally failing to protect the environment, and we're failing because people aren't valuing it enough. People aren't valuing the natural world. They'll create some road scheme or a supermarket or the motorway service station in Smithy Wood at Chapeltown, right on the edge of Sheffield, which they want to build in an ancient woodland, and they see the value of what is going to be destroyed as effectively zero. Whereas they're seeing all the dollar signs associated with the development which they want to put in instead. So if we were to value, to price the natural world, and to say, actually, it's really worth something because it delivers these ecosystem services to us in the form of green infrastructure and asset classes within an ecosystems market, i.e. water, air, soil, the rest of it, then perhaps we'll be able to weigh into that and persuade people who are otherwise unpersuadable that this is really worth preserving. And they also point out that through that agenda you can raise a lot of money, which isn't otherwise available for the ordinary kinds of conservation projects. And as I say, these are plausible and respectable arguments. And I think they are the road to ruin, or the road to even greater ruin than we have at the moment. And let me start to lay out why, with an escalating series of arguments. I say escalating because they're escalating in what I consider to be their importance, starting off with the relatively trivial and becoming more and more serious as we go along. So perhaps the most trivial argument against this, though it is nonetheless a relatively weighty one, is that in the great majority of cases, the efforts to price the natural world, which lie really at the heart of this whole natural capital agenda, are complete and utter gobbledygook. And the reason why they are complete and utter gobbledygook is that they are looking at values which are non-commensurable. They are trying to compare apples and pears, things which cannot be directly compared. And the result of that is that they come out with stuff like the Natural Capital Committee came out with in its latest report. The Natural Capital Committee is something set up by this government, supposedly in pursuit of better means of protecting the natural world. Though with this government, that sounds a highly implausible proposition. And the Natural Capital Committee produced this report a couple of weeks ago, which said, for example, that if freshwater ecosystems in this country were better protected, the aesthetic value addition of that protection would be £700 million. That's the aesthetic value, i.e. what it looks like. Well, how much we like what it looks like is valued at £700 million. It said that if grassland sites of special scientific interest were better protected, their wildlife value would increase by £40 million. The value of their wildlife, like the sort of chalk hill blues and the dog violets and stuff which live on grasslands and SSSIs, would be enhanced by £40 million. These figures, ladies and gentlemen, are marmalade. They are finely shredded, boiled to a pulp, heavily sweetened, and still indigestible. In other words, they are total gibberish. But they're not the worst. They're not the worst I've come across. Under the last government, because this started a little while back, the Department for Transport claimed to have discovered, I quote, the true value of time. Let me read you the surreal sentence in which this bombshell was dropped. Forecast growth in the real value of time is shown in Table 3. Seriously, you can see it? Yeah, there it was, the real value of time. You can actually see a graph, you know, going up. Growth in the real value of time. The Department for Environment, DEFRA, when it launched the National Ecosystem Assessment in 2011, came out with something equally interesting. It said it had established the true value of nature for the very first time. Unfortunately, it didn't yet give us a figure for the true value of nature, but it did manage to provide figures for particular components of the value of nature. And let me just give you one of these. It said that if we looked after our parks and greens well, they will enhance our well-being to the tune of £290 per household per year in 2060. So what does it mean by this? Well, the well-being is composed of recreation, health and solace, natural spaces in which our culture finds its roots and sense of place, shared social value arising from developing a sense of purpose and being able to achieve important personal goals and participate in society, enhanced by supportive personal relationships and strong and inclusive communities. So you put solace and sense of place and shared social value and personal goals and supportive personal relationships and strong and inclusive communities all together into one figure, and you come up with £290 per household per year. All we require now is for the Cabinet Office to give us a price for love and a true value of society, and we'll have a single figure for the meaning of life. I know what you're thinking, and I know what you're thinking. It was 42, but deep thought failed to anticipate the advent of Strictly Come Dancing, which has depreciated the will to live to the extent that it's now been reduced to 41. It's total and utter gobbledygook. It's complete rubbish. And surely anyone can see it's complete rubbish. Not only is it complete rubbish, it is unimprovable rubbish. You cannot make a silk purse out of that pig's ear. It's not possible to have meaningful figures coming out of values which cannot be in any sensible way measured in financial terms. Now, there are some things that you can do. They're pretty limited, but there are some genuinely commensurable payoffs to do with the natural world. So, for instance, a friend of mine I was talking to the other day, he said, what's the most lucrative investment that a landowner can make? And I said, oh, I don't know, probably some new form of agricultural subsidy. And he said an osprey. He said, look at Bassenthwaite in the Lake District, where there's a pair of ospreys breeding. And the owners of the land around it, they have 300,000 people visiting them every year, and they charge them for car parking. And they make probably about £1 million a year from the car parking. Now, you can look at that, and you can say, right, there's £1 million you make from this piece of land by having a couple of ospreys there. Nice work if you can get it. And you can compare it to what you were doing before then, which was rearing sheep on the land, which is only viable because of farm subsidies, because it's a complete waste of time and money. It is in several senses, but in this case, you actually lose money by keeping sheep on the land, at the same time as trashing the environment. It's almost entirely sheep-wrecked in the Lake District. So you've got this direct comparison, and fantastic. You know, the ospreys come out looking very good from it, because you've got two land uses directly commensurable, because both of them are costed directly in pounds. I've got no problem with that at all. And you come out of that and say, there's a powerful economic argument for having ospreys rather than sheep. But these are limited applications. I mean, there are one or two others you can think of. You can look at, for instance, watersheds. And I know that there's an insurance company which costed Pimlimon, the highest mountain in the Cambrian Mountains, and worked out that it would be cheaper to buy Pimlimon and reforest it in order to slow down the flow of water into the lowlands than to keep paying out every year for carpets in Gloucester. And again, there were some directly commensurable values. You know, the land would cost such and such. You're likely to be able to slow down the flow of water through reforestation to such and such an extent. That would reduce the flood frequency to such and such a level, and you would be paying out less. You know, there were quite a few assumptions in there, but you could pretty well mash it together and come out with a rough ballpark figure, which again is commensurable. But in the great majority of cases, you are not looking at anything remotely resembling financial commensurability or financial measurement. So that is problem one. And that's the most trivial of the problems. So you can see, if that's the most trivial of them, there are quite a few problems here. Problem two is that you are effectively pushing the natural world even further into the system that is eating it alive. And Dieter Helm, the chairman of the Natural Capital Committee, the government's committee, in this same report I quoted from just a moment ago, he said the following. He said, the environment is part of the economy and needs to be properly integrated into it so that growth opportunities will not be missed. And there, ladies and gentlemen, you have what seems to me the government's real agenda. This is not to protect the natural world from the depredations of the economy. It's to harness the natural world in pursuit of the thing which has been destroying it to such an extent, which is economic growth and everything that goes with it. And all the things which have been so damaging to the natural world are now being sold to us as being its salvation. Commodification, economic growth, financialization, abstraction, all of those things are supposed to be what's going to protect the living planet. Oh, sorry, did I say living planet? I keep getting confused about this. Asset classes within an ecosystem market. Sorry. And it gets far worse still when you look at the way in which this is being done, which almost instantly, as soon as the government's ecosystem markets task force, which is another of these exotic vehicles for chopping up nature and turning it into money, as soon as that reported, it straight away was pushing nature towards the model of financialization. And here's one of the things it said. It talks of harnessing city financial expertise to assess the ways that these blended revenue streams and securitizations enhance the return on investment of an environmental bond, which gives you an idea of what the agenda is, as well as the amount of gobbledygook it's already generating. And what we're talking about, basically, is giving the natural world to the city to look after. The City of London, the financial sector. What could possibly go wrong? Here we have a sector which, its wealth is built on debt. On the creation of debt. That's how it works. On stacking up future liabilities, basically on shafting the future in order to serve the present. That's the model. And then that debt is sliced up, slice, and chopped into all these weird exotic vehicles like collateralized debt obligations and all the things which worked out so well last time round, didn't they? And now nature is to be captured and recruited by the city. They're literally put into the care of the city, as that quote suggests, and given to them to look after. This is utterly insane. But in order for them to extract any value from it, the same task force says, we need to unbundle ecosystem services so that they can be individually traded. And that's the only way in which it can work, this financialization and securitization and bond issuing and all the rest of it that they're talking about. It has to be unbundled. And if there is one thing we know about ecosystems, we know it the more we discover about them, is that you cannot safely disaggregate their functions without destroying the whole damn thing. That they function as coherent, holistic systems which depend upon each other. The different elements depend upon each other, and their resilience is dependent upon the diversity of systems which come together in an ecosystem. The moment you start to unbundle those and to trade them separately, you create a formula for disaster. Okay, that was problem 2. Problem 3 is something which, well, I assume it must be a very rude word because hardly anyone ever uses it, certainly not in polite society. It begins with a P, and it's 5 letters long. And a lot of people who you would expect to come out with it, and perhaps if they sort of drop a hammer on their toe or something they do, don't seem to be able to utter this word. And it is, of course, power. Power is the great issue which in this entire agenda of the pricing and commodification of nature seems to get left out. And because it gets left out, because it gets almost, I think, deliberately overlooked, what we're effectively seeing with the natural capital agenda is the invocation of money as a kind of fairy dust, as something that you sprinkle over all the unresolved problems of power and expect them magically to resolve themselves. But because they're unresolved, because they're unaddressed, because they're even unacknowledged, they are actively disavowed. Not only can they not resolve themselves, but the natural capital agenda cannot possibly work under those circumstances, circumstances which I believe are absolutely integral and inherent to the pricing agenda. So, for example, and to give you an example of where, in principle, a pricing system could work, because you're looking at high commensurability, you're looking at very simple and straightforward outputs, you're looking at quite a simple and straightforward monitoring system, so everything's lined up, all the ducks are lined up for a system which should be able to work. And that's the European emissions trading system for trying to reduce carbon emissions by setting a carbon price or creating a carbon price. And I'm not inherently opposed to it. I can see it's potentially as good a mechanism as any other for trying gradually to decarbonize society, as we ought to be doing. But it has been an utter and total failure. An effective price for carbon begins at about £30 a tonne. That's the point at which you begin to see serious industrial change in response of disinvestment in fossil fuels, investment instead in low-carbon technologies and all this sort of energy-saving technologies and the rest of it, which we so desperately need to see. Almost throughout its history, throughout the history of the European emissions trading scheme system, the price of carbon has hovered around €5. And that's where it is today. And whatever happens, there'll be a little fillip here of 20 cents, and then it go up and down 20 cents, but it'll hover around €4 to €5. And the reason for that is a very old-fashioned one. It's that the heavily polluting industries, the carbon-intensive industries, which were being asked to change their practices, lobbied very heavily the governments of the European Union and the European Commission and the MEPs to ensure that they received an over-allocation of carbon permits. Far too many permits were issued, with the result that the prices stayed very low. And when the European Parliament started talking about withdrawing some of those permits, they too were lobbied and they caved in and failed to withdraw them, so the prices stayed very low. And what we see here is the age-old problem of power. Governments and the Commission are failing to assert political will. They are failing to stand up for themselves and say, this is how the market is going to function. It's not going to function without this dirigiste and interventionist approach. And without that dirigiste and interventionist approach, we end up with something which is almost entirely useless. In fact, worse than useless, because I don't think there has been a single coal-burning power station, motorway or airport in the European Union since the ETS came along, which has not been justified with reference to the market created by the trading system. And what's happened is that you haven't changed anything by sprinkling money over the problem. You've merely called it something else. You've called it a market as opposed to a political system. But you still need the regulatory involvement of the state to make that market work. But because we persuade ourselves that we don't need that anymore because it is a market and because there's money involved, we end up fudging the issue of power and not addressing those underlying problems. So to give you another example, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity exercise overseen by Pavan Sukhdev from Deutsche Bank is huge, huge exercise, involving a vast amount of expenditure on it, which came up with all these totally bogus figures as to what things were worth. But anyway, it came up with one or two which maybe weren't so bogus, and one of the most famous ones was its valuation of mangrove forests. And it said, look, if some businessman or businesswoman comes along and cuts down the mangrove forest and replaces it with a shrimp farm, that will be worth around $1,200 per hectare per year to that person. If we leave the mangrove forest standing, because it protects the local communities who live on the coastline, and because it's such a wonderful breeding ground for fish and crustacean and all the rest of it, which the local fisherfolk use, it'll be worth $12,000 per hectare per year, as opposed to $1,200, it'd be worth $12,000 per hectare per year. So look, by publishing the figures, we have demonstrated that it makes sense to save the mangrove forests and not to cut them down. Therefore, this will change the way that things happen. My left foot. People have known for centuries, literally for centuries, the tremendous benefits which mangrove forests deliver. But has that protected them from being turned into shrimp farms or beach resorts or whatever it happens to be? No, it hasn't. And the reason it hasn't is that it might be worth $12,000 to the local impoverished community of fisherfolk, but the fact that it's worth $1,200 to a powerful local politician who wants to turn it into shrimp farms, that, when you're faced with the realities of power, is what counts. And putting a price on it doesn't in any way change that relationship. In fact, again, what it does is to create this false reassurance which says problem solved. You do not solve the problem that way. You do not solve the problem without confronting power. And yet, what we're doing here is reinforcing power, is strengthening the power of the people with the money, is strengthening the power of the economic system as a whole against the power of nature. Let me give you one or two examples of that. Let's start on the outskirts of Sheffield with Smithy Wood. This is an ancient woodland which 800 years ago was recorded as providing charcoal for the monks who were making iron there. It's a critically important part of Sheffield's history and culture. It's full of stories and a sense of place and a sense of being able to lose yourself in something completely different. And someone wants to turn the half of Smithy Wood, the great centre of Smithy Wood, completely fragmenting it into a motorway service station. Now, this might have been unthinkable until relatively recently. But it is thinkable now because the government has introduced something, or it's in the process of introducing something called biodiversity offsets. If you trash a piece of land here, you can replace its value by creating some habitat elsewhere. And this is a sort of ties in with this whole element of fungibility, of tradability, of being able to change places one thing and another, where nature is sort of dematerialized and turned into something which can be traded either in the form of money or in the form of something which is said to have similar value. And what they say is, look, we're going to plant 60,000 saplings with rabbit guards around them in some other place, and that'll make up for trashing Smithy Wood. And it seems to me to be unlikely that anyone would have given that proposal to trash Smithy Wood, this ancient woodland, and build a service station in the middle of it, were it not for that mechanism of biodiversity offsets. So something which the government has tried to sell to us as protecting nature actually greatly threatens nature, nature as understood by the people who love it as a source of wonder and delight and enchantment, which is what an ancient woodland certainly is for me, and I dare say for many other people in this room, as opposed to little trees with rabbit guards around them planted on the slip road, or, as it turns out, in the path of HS2, where they're all going to get cut down again. And that's just one example. Let me give you another one. Say we decide that we're going to value nature in terms of pounds or dollars or euros, and that's going to be our primary metric for deciding what should be saved and what should not be saved. And this is supposed to be an empowering tool to protect the natural world from destruction and degradation. Well, you go to a public inquiry, and you find that miraculously, while your wood, which you're trying to save, has been valued at X pounds, the road which they want to build through the wood has been valued at X plus 1. And let me tell you, it will always be valued at X plus 1 because cost-benefit analyses for these things are always profoundly rigged. The barrister will then be able to say, well, there you are, there's a metric, it's X plus 1 for the road and X for the wood. End of argument. All those knotty issues to do with values and love and desire and wonder and delight and enchantment, all the issues which are actually at the centre of democratic politics, are suddenly ruled out. They're outside the box. They're outside the envelope of discussion. They no longer count. We've been totally disempowered by that process. At the moment, we see a phenomenon called green grabbing, whereas forests in the developing world acquire value which is meant to protect them as something to trade off against our carbon emissions here. local communities are being pushed off those forest lands, and in some cases, the forests are being converted to plantations because there are multiple uses as well as carbon storage and the rest of it. And exactly the processes you're trying to avert are accelerated by this financialization and fungibility of nature. So that was problem 3, or 4. Where have we got to? 3, still the problem of power. But the real problem, and this comes to the nub of the argument for me, is over the issues which I will describe as values and framing. Now, am I allowed to mention Sheffield, Hallam? I've just done so it's too late. In response to an article I wrote vaguely on this issue last week, Professor Lynn Crowe from Sheffield, Hallam wrote what I thought was a very thoughtful piece in which she said the following. She asked this question: how else can we address the challenge of convincing those who do not share the same values as ourselves of our case? In other words, we're trying to make a case to people who just don't care about the natural world. How do we convince them, when they don't share those values, of our case? And to me, the answer is very simple. We don't. We don't. We never have, and we never will. That is not how politics works. Tony was talking about Ed Miliband. Picture a situation where Ed Miliband stands up in the House of Commons and makes such a persuasive speech. Okay, this is getting surreal. Such a persuasive speech that David Cameron says, you know, you've completely won me over. I'm crossing the floor and joining the Labour benches. It doesn't happen. That's not how it works. That's not how politics has ever proceeded. Except 1 or 2 fantastic, infinitesimally rare cases. You do not win your opponents over so that they come onto your side. What you do to be effective in politics is, first of all, to empower and mobilize people on your own side, and secondly, then to win over the undecided people in the middle. But the hardcore of your opponents who absolutely do not share your values, you are not going to win over. It's not going to work. That's not how it works. And this is the horrendous mistake which New Labour here and the Democratic Party in the United States have made, where pursuing short-term goals, we've got to win the next election, so we've got to appease people who don't share our values, so we're going to become like them. Instead of trying to assert our own values, we're going to go over to them and say, look, yeah, we're not really red. We're not scary at all. We're really conservatives. And that was Tony Blair's message. That, I'm afraid, is Barack Obama's message. It was certainly Bill Clinton's message. Is this whole approach of triangulation, which possibly won elections, so in 1997 a bucket on a stick would have won, but greatly eroded, in our case, the Labour vote across the intervening years. And we've ended up with a situation where there are effectively no political alternatives to the neoliberalism being advanced by the coalition government, where the opposition is, on almost every case, failing to oppose. And it is in that position because it has progressively neutralized itself by trying to appease people who do not share its values. And as George Lakoff, the man who has done so much, a cognitive linguist who has done so much to explain why progressive parties keep losing the elections that they should win and keep losing support even in the midst of an economic crisis and environmental crisis and every other kind of crisis caused by their political opponents, and why still they can't capitalize on them. As he points out, you can never win by adopting the values of your opponents, by trying to go across to meet them. You have to leave them where they are and then project your own values to people who might be persuaded to hear those values and might come over to your side. And that way, which is exactly what the Conservatives have done on both sides of the Atlantic, they've been extremely good at that, especially in the United States, where they basically cross their arms and say, right, we're here, we don't care, we don't give a damn about what you stand for, you hippies on the left. This is what we stand for, and we're going to project it, until you feel that you have to come to us. And so what we've got there is a Democratic Party which is indistinguishable from where the Republicans were 10 years ago. It has gone so far to the right that it has lost its core values. And I think you can say the same about the Labour Party in this country. And that, in effect, is what we're being asked to do through this pricing of everything agenda, where we're saying because our opponents don't share our values and they're the people wrecking the environment, we have to go over to them and say, we like you really, all we care about is money, we don't really care about nature for its own sake, we don't really believe in any of this intrinsic stuff, we don't believe in wonder and delight and enchantment, we just want to show you that it's going to make money. And of course, A, it's not going to work because they'll always, the cost-benefit analysis will be rigged against it, but B, so much more damagingly, we completely destroy our own moral authority and legitimacy and position in so doing. And it was very telling to me, and I was so pleased to see it, that in a recent interview, George Lakoff, who is the guy who really put the formulation of values as the absolute key to political success on the map, the thing which he singled out as making him groan most with utter despair was the attempt to monetize nature in order to save it, where he was arguing that well-meaning people were trying to do the right thing, but were completely failing to apply a frames analysis. A frame is the mental structure which you use to approach and understand an issue, a frames analysis to what they were doing. And as a result, instead of framing it with their own values and describing and projecting their values, which is the only thing in the medium to long term which ever works, they were throwing all those over, surrendering them, and going over to the values of the people who are wrecking the environment. And how could there be any long-term impact of that other than more destruction? Well, let me put it another way. There's another way of looking at this which says the same thing in different ways. All of us are a mixture, or we're somewhere along the spectrum, I guess you could say, between intrinsic values and extrinsic values. Now, extrinsic values are all about fame and image and money. It's about driving down the street in your Ferrari and showing it to everyone, something obviously I do on a daily basis. It's about having these external justifiers and motivators and seeing yourself in the light that other people see you in and requiring that approbation, that social approbation for your own sense of well-being. Intrinsic values are about being more comfortable with yourself, about who you are, about being embedded in your family, your community, among your friends, whoever you're with, and not requiring that constant show of sort of resource-holding potential, as biologists would call it, as sort of being the big man or the big woman with the hairy chest, in the man's case, showing that you're the alpha male or indeed the alpha female without the hairy chest, in order to demonstrate to yourself, really, that you are worth something, which you need if you have a strong set of extrinsic values. And research in 70 countries produces remarkably consistent results that these values are very highly clustered. So, for instance, people who greatly value financial success tend to have much lower empathy than those with a strong set of intrinsic values, much less concern about the environment and the natural world. They tend to have much more of a tendency towards hierarchy and status. These are very, very strongly clustered. But we are not born with these values. They are the product, very largely, of our social environment, our social and our political environment. And what the research also shows is that if you change that environment, people's values shift en masse with that change. So if, for instance, you have what in the United States they dismissively call socialized medicine, and we call the NHS, you have a good functioning health system where no one is left behind, where everybody is treated, that embeds and imbues among the population a strong set of intrinsic values, because you say, oh, I live in a society where everyone's looked after. That must be a good thing because that's the society that I live in, and you absorb and internalize those values. If, on the other hand, you live in a devil-take-the-hindmost society where people, as they do in the United States, literally die on the street because they cannot afford medical care, that will reinforce extrinsic values and push you further towards that end of the spectrum. And the more that spectrum shifts, the more the values shift with it. And people on the right, they understand this very well. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher famously said, economics is the method, I'm going to get this wrong, aren't I? Economics is the method, the object is to change the heart and the soul. She completely understood about changing people's values, something the left has never grasped. And if we surrender to the financial agenda, and if we say, oh, this market-led neoliberalism thing is the way forward, then we shift social values, because let's face it, we, and I'm talking about environmentalists here, are among the last lines of defense against that gradual societal shift towards extrinsic values. And if we don't stand up and say, we do not share those values, our values are intrinsic values, we care about people, we care about the natural world, we are embedded in our communities and the people around us, and we want to protect them, not just ourselves. We are not going to be selfish. This isn't about money. Unless you do that, who else is going to do it? And so you say to me, well, what do we do instead? You produce these arguments against trying to save nature by pricing it, by financialization, by monetization, by valuation, by all of these things. You produce these arguments. What do you do instead? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is no mystery. It is the same answer that it has always been, the same answer that it always will be, and the same thing we just cannot damn well be bothered to get off our bottoms to do, which is the only thing that works. In fact, there's 3 things that work. The 3 essential keys to all political change, which apply to protecting the environment as much as they apply to everything else, are in this order: mobilization, mobilization, and mobilization. It's the only thing that ever works. And everything else is a fudge and a substitute and an excuse for not doing that thing that works. And that applies to attempts to monetize and financialize nature or anything else as much as it does to all the other political issues we are failing to get to grips with. Thank you.